On today's episode of Let's Talk Drones, we are continuing our NDAA compliant FPV build series. We'll be integrating the flight controller and the receiver. And no, you're not having deja vu. You've already heard these words mentioned here on the channel. In fact, in the last episode of this series, I share with you some things that went very, very wrong for me when trying to integrate the flight controller for the very first time. If you haven't seen that video, I highly recommend you go check it out before you watch this one so you can get the full story. Without further ado, let's talk drones. What's up? It's Chris the Drone Geek and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Drones. I have a lot to get through before we get over to the workbench, so I'm going to move as quickly as I can. Luckily, integrating the flight controller and the receiver is a pretty straightforward and relatively quick process, so it gives me a little bit more time here to touch on some information that's going to be important to know moving into the integration of these two components. So we do have our flight controller and our receiver here ready to go. If you didn't watch the last video, I highly recommend you go watch that video. I think it's episode 4, but if not, it's certainly the video that's right before this one on the NDAA FPV playlist. So check that out. I fried 3, count them, 3 flight controllers in a matter of about 5 minutes trying to integrate them onto the build. I really ham-fisted it. It is my fault entirely for not looking closer at a wiring chart and understanding how all of the different components are wired together. So my ham-fisting resulted in my own downfall, which is typically how that goes for me. But the fine folks over at ORQA, our friends, I can say that with full confidence now, our friends over at ORQA really hooked us up. Not only did they replace both of the flight controllers of theirs that I fried, they also sent me 2 electronic speed controllers, a low light and daylight FPV camera, and 4 receivers. So I've got 4 ghost receivers, a camera, and an ESC, all of which are NDAA compliant. I really strongly considered integrating these into this build and replacing the parts that I had listed, including the ESC, which we've already integrated onto the frame, with this ESC. I'm not going to do that. And the reason I'm not going to do that has nothing to do with my belief in ORQA as a company or their components. I love ORQA, and the components that they sell are very high quality. The reason that I'm not going to do that is because in episode 1, I share with you a parts list. And I know that there are at least a handful of you out there that are following along with this. You've already purchased the parts that I have laid out. And because of that, I feel veering off course in that regard would be a little bit unfair, especially since we're talking about NDAA compliant components, which are kind of hard to come by in some regards, especially harder than the Chinese counterparts, which you can find basically like water right now. So I'm not going to shy away from the TBS ESC. I'm going to stick with that. Now that I understand it, I know that we can create a build that is going to do what we need it to do with it. I do want to thank ORQA for sending these components over. And the reason I'm not actually going to integrate the camera has nothing to do with the component that it would replace, because actually the component it would replace is a Chinese component, and integrating this camera would bring us one step closer to a fully NDAA compliant build and future-proof that drone in that regard. The reason I'm not going to integrate this purely has to do with its footprint. This is a wide-bodied FPV camera. It's a really cool camera. And again, it is a low light camera and daylight camera, so you can use it both during daytime conditions as well as after dark. It's just too big. It doesn't fit in the front end of our TBS Source 1 V5 frame. It's just a little too wide. And I know that there's ways I could modify that maybe and make it fit. It just gets outside of the scope of what this series is, which is giving you a low cost, or as low cost as possible, an easy to follow tutorial on how to build your own NDAA compliant drone, at least an FPV drone. So with that said, as much as I appreciate this ORQA, we're going to have to go ahead and relegate this to a build series in the future, which I actually plan on doing because ORQA's generosity inspired me to do a build series where we only use ORQA components. That'll be coming in the future. And for those of you that get the build bug like I currently have, I know that you'll be interested in that because, again, ORQA's components work really well with other ecosystems, but they especially work well within their own ecosystem, working together with their own components. So I will find a frame that fits this camera and we will integrate the camera, the ESC, and the flight controller into an ORQA-only build in a future build series. So I really want to just double down and thank ORQA for their generosity, because without them, we certainly wouldn't have the outlook we do with this series in terms of getting it done sooner rather than later, and we certainly would be spending a lot more money than I would have felt comfortable spending for a project like this. I would have done it because I started something with you guys and I want to finish it for you, but it would have been a really hard pill to swallow, and ORQA came through clutch and helped me avoid a very, very expensive lesson. So that said, I want to get into the componentry of our flight controller and our receiver. Before we take it over to the workbench, I think it's important that you look at what we're dealing with here. I'm going to start with the receiver. So you'll see there on the left, you have T, S, V, I think is what it is, and G. Those pads on the left that are coated in solder. That's from my first attempt at integrating these into our build. These are the different wiring mechanisms that you'll use to integrate your receiver into your flight controller so that the two can communicate with one another. We'll talk about how we wire those once we get over to the workbench, but that's what you're looking at there. That golden circle in the middle on the right hand side, that's where we're going to plug our antenna in so that we can broadcast, or actually receive input rather, from our controller. And then on the top there is our LED light that's going to give us status indications when we are setting up and configuring our receiver. And that black square there at the bottom, it has a little button that's also black. It's kind of hard to see. That's to cycle through different modes on our receiver so that we can configure it the way we need it to be configured. So we'll talk about configuring our receiver probably in a different video, just because this one has a little bit more to it when it comes to the flight controller. We'll talk about that later on in the series, how you actually configure your receiver and set it up so that it communicates back and forth with your controller. When we look at the flight controller, we have a few different JST ports. Now, the JST ports on this flight controller are different than the JST ports on our ESC, which led to some of the confusion on my part when integrating the two together onto the build. The JSTs on the ORQA flight controller are JST GHs. So these have different connectors than a traditional JST used on an FPV component. You'll want to keep that in mind. There will be some wiring required on your part, whether it's sliding the bracketed ends or the ends that have the little crimps on them into a standard JST connector, or just directly soldering them onto your different components and into the ESC. So all that in mind, let's go ahead and look at each of these JST ports. First of all, on the top left, we have our ESC port. This is where we're going to plug our flight controller into our ESC. Next to that, on the right, we have our camera port. That's where we're going to plug our FPV camera into the flight controller so that the FPV camera can then communicate with the VTX and send the video signal back to our goggles. On the left there, you'll see a GPS port. We're not going to be utilizing this because we don't have a GPS scheduled for this build. It's just something that adds a layer of complication to this that I don't think most beginners want to get involved with, and I just really don't want to configure a GPS and spend a whole episode doing that. Maybe in the future when we do a different build, a long-range build, but for a 5-inch freestyle, we don't really need a GPS. It's kind of silly to integrate one in. At the bottom there, you'll see an MFC. This is our multi-flight controller. So if we had more components that plugged into different flight controllers and communicated differently, or we had something that required input from the flight controller, we'd plug it into this port. Next to that, on the right, we have our VTX port. This is going to be where we plug our VTX in. Eventually, this will receive data from the flight controller that is received from the camera, and it will broadcast it back to our goggles while we're flying. And finally, we have our SIK port. This is going to be where we plug our receiver in. So whatever protocol you're using, whether it's Ghost or a different one, that's going to be plugged into this port. Make sure you remember that, because it's going to be crucial you remember that and get that corrected, because it's not just labeled receiver or REC, it's labeled SIK, which is vastly different from everything else that's labeled on the flight controller. You also have a USB-C port on the flight controller right here. Let me just make sure that I am focused in so that you can see that. Yes, okay, right there. That is going to be utilized for configuring your flight controller and the settings and parameters and tuning and things like that on your drone once the time comes. So that's going to be important for that particular aspect. The only other thing I'll note is you'll see here I have yellow vibration dampeners on my flight controller. These are not stock. The ones that ORQA sends, my only criticism of ORQA is that the vibration dampeners they send with their flight controller are a little bit too short for my liking. So to avoid any issues with contacts that we don't want in flight or in a crash that might create a short, I added just slightly taller vibration dampeners, particularly on that bottom part where it's going to hover above our ESC. So I highly recommend you do that. I've got M3 vibration dampeners, so they can accommodate an M3 screw, which is what we're using for our standoffs for our stack. So keep that in mind. You may be able to do it, and you may be able to actually replace the vibration dampeners on your ESC and make the top end a little bit taller, which will eliminate the need for taller vibration dampeners on this. But I just like to have a little bit more clearance. More clearance is typically better, so keep that in mind. And when we're talking about anatomy and how it relates to a drone, I just want you to look at these two components. We talked about the ESC. The ESC is like the heart of our drone. It pumps the energy or the oxygen or the electricity to different parts of the drone to make sure that they're functioning correctly, much like your heart pumps blood, which carries oxygen to your muscles and your organs to ensure that they're working properly. If we think of it in those terms, our receiver is essentially like our ears. This is listening for commands from the controller so that it tells the drone what to do. It actually tells the brain of the drone what to do so that it moves in the way that you want it to move. So think of your receiver as ears for your drone, and I already sort of alluded to this. The flight controller is the brain. This is what's telling everything else on the drone what to do. It's relaying information to different parts of the drone and back to the operator. It's doing all of the thinking for the drone. So this is your brain. Just looking at one other aspect of our flight controller before we get over to the workbench, you'll see the numbers in the name. This is the ORQA F405. You'll see other flight controllers for sale on the internet as you're shopping. One of the other numbers you're going to see is like F722. Essentially, the numbers that are most important in that sequence are F4 and F7. The difference between an F4 and an F7 flight controller all has to do with processing power. An F4 flight controller has less processing power than an F7. So if you have more components that require more data processing, you're going to want to go with an F7. Like if we had a GPS on board, or we had servos on board, or we had something that communicates information to and from the flight controller, an F7 is going to be better suited for a build like that. For a dumb drone, is what I call them, a freestyle drone that we're just going to be ripping around for fun, we don't really need anything more than an F4, and it also helps to keep our costs down. The ORQA F405, I think, is around $130 or $140 US. If we were to have an F7 counterpart, it would likely be a little more expensive. So we are saving money by going with an F405, and quite frankly, I've never really run into a scenario with the builds that I do where I needed anything more than an F4. I do have other builds that have F7s on them, but frankly, it's probably overkill for what I use my FPV drones for. On top of that, F7s also have more flexibility when it comes to how you utilize the UART port, so you can do more with an F7 flight controller than you can an F4, but again, for the build that we're doing right here, right now, we don't need an F7 flight controller. An F405 is going to be perfect. The only other number you need to know about on this flight controller right now is the 30-30. That just has to do with the mounting pattern. That 30-30 means that we have a 30 millimeter by 30 millimeter mounting pattern here when it comes to putting this on the drone. So we know where to position our mounting holes and our mounting screws so that we can stack the components on top of each other and have them all line up. That's all the information you need to know. I'm sorry I packed it in to such a quick, short, little brief at the beginning of this video, but it was either that or have like a 45-minute video, which I know you don't want. Let's go ahead and get over to the workbench. All right, this is gonna be a pretty quick, easy process overall compared to some of the other stuff we're gonna be doing, but the hardest part and the most involved part is getting the receiver set up. So we have our receiver chip here. I've got this zoomed in as far as I can with the camera without losing too much video quality. The first thing we're gonna wanna do is actually add the solder to our receiver, because if you look closely, let's make sure that goes into focus. You'll see that there are holes. That you can definitely see them in two of the pads. I have solder in the other two holes, but you'll see holes there. We're actually going to take our receiver wires and push them through those holes so that we have a nice grasp with the solder, a nice connection between the solder and the wires. So in the interest of making this as easy as possible, you're going to need two things. First of all, you're going to need to pre-solder your pads. And I don't mean pre-tin. You're going to want to pre-solder them so you have your nice little solder balls on the top of the receiver. The next thing you're going to need is a set of helping hands, which if you don't know what those are, they're just little mechanical clips that you just can clip into place that will hold smaller components. Really helpful for when you need a few different things going on at the same time. You'll get to see that here in just a few minutes. But let's go ahead and add our solder to our pads. Just gonna go ahead, we have a nice pencil tip here on our soldering iron. Just wanna make sure that comes into focus so you can see what kind of tip we're using. I'm just gonna go ahead and dip that into our flux very quickly. And then from here, we are going to just go down the pads, heat those up. I apologize if it's hard to see. Again, we're working with really small components here. And then once the pads are heated, we'll go ahead, we'll just add a bit of solder so that we have a nice ball that forms on the pad. And because this is such a small component, you won't really need to wait long between pads before incorporating more solder, because the whole little component is going to get very, very warm very, very quickly. So we do have a little bit, there we go. I'm gonna go ahead and clean my tip off there. When I touch just even the slightest bit of the solder on this, it heats up and liquefies very quickly. Now I do have a little bit of an issue there where I've got solder that's connecting between two of the pads, and that's pretty easy to mitigate. You just sort of have to work it a little bit, get that nice and warm. I'm gonna go ahead and clean this solder off the tip. Continue to work it. I think that's about good. We've got our little solder balls on the chip. This is going to be very hot to the touch because we've just applied all that heat to it. So be careful when picking it up. Now I'm gonna go ahead and cut the camera and then bring you back once we've got our receiver in our helping hands. It's ideal to have helping hands that have rubberized tips on them. You can get these individually that clamp to your desk. I have a nice little lighting setup here that gives me a nice little LED light above that lights everything up really nicely. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the included cable, wire, JST connector, JST GH connector, which has our blue, red, and green and black wires on it. This is going to be for your receiver, and we're going to take the other end. There might already be crimps on this. I can't remember from when I received this. You're gonna cut the crimps off and you're gonna strip the wire, and then you're going to pre-tin your tips. Again, I already tried this once, and that's where I really muffed it up in that other video and fried those flight controllers. So I do have some of these steps completed ahead of time. It's nothing we haven't already talked about in other components of this build series. So it's nothing that you should struggle with too much. So I'm gonna go ahead and unbraid or untwist my receiver wires here so that they are easier to work with. Now, you'll see on your board here, your receiver board, we have TS positive is the number that I saw there, not H, not the letter H, and then ground. So pretty straightforward how this is gonna work. We're gonna put our black wire in the ground. We're gonna put our red wire into the positive, that's our power lead. Then we're gonna put our S, which I believe is our receiver. That's going to go to our our transmitter on our flight controller. So when we look back at that diagram of the flight controller, we want to look at how those things plug in relation to the wires on this plug. So when we look at that, you'll see that blue is the RX wire and green is the TX wire. So when we're looking at the connector that was sent to us by ORQA with our flight controller, we will want our blue wire to go to the T pad on our receiver and our green wire to go to the S pad on our receiver. So sort of a little bit backwards there. Again, that's how those things communicate. You need to think transmission to reception. So you always want to wire your R to your T and your T to your R. You don't want to go R to R, T to T. Nothing bad inherently will happen or should happen, but it just won't work. So that's what you need to keep in mind there. So let's go ahead and start with the very easy and straightforward ones first. We'll go ahead and get our handy dandy tweezers out. I'm doing all of this off camera because there's really no better way to do it at this point. I'm gonna bring my soldering iron in, and I just wanna make sure I see some little hairs that are sticking off of the wire. I want to make sure everything is as compact as possible because we will want to, and I want to make sure this is lined up as well on my end. I apologize in advance for moving the camera around. I just want to make sure you guys are set and can see what I'm doing. Oh, I dropped my wire. I want to guide this red wire, our power lead, to the hole on the pad. and I want to sort of press it up against that. And the reason I want to do that is because then, once I've got those two things lined up, the wire and the hole, I'm going to go ahead and just heat up this solder, and that will give way for the wire to go through the hole in the pad. There we go. I fed it through. It should stay there, and now that I've lost some of my solder, I'm going to go ahead and reapply some of it. It shouldn't take very long. Oh, I lost some of my wire. Oh, no, I didn't. Everything looks fine. Okay, actually, that's a good grab. I don't need to add any more solder. I believe we're all set in there. We are. Okay, so we've got our power lead in there. Now we just need to do the same thing with our ground. And I like to keep these all spread out as possible because it makes it easier then to braid it at the end. And this ground wire has actually got a much nicer tip to it. So I'm gonna go ahead. Bingo, pretty easy there. And then just let me double check here. The receiver wire, R, is our blue wire. So we wanna actually put that in the T down at the bottom here. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. You can probably see the bottom half of my face. There we go. We have a little bit of the solder sticking up. And it doesn't have to be perfectly clean, guys, on a solder perspective, because we're going to be heat shrinking this so that there's no electronic connection between the frame and the receiver, or the frame and the FC, or the flight controller, or the ESC, or whatever. So it's not crucially important that, you know, it looks beautiful. We need to have a solid connection. That's the big thing. All right, this is our last wire. This is our transmitter wire that's going into our receiver port. There we go. Clean my tip off here for a second, and then there we go. And I actually got a nice poke through there. I do want to push this down. Bingo. And I also want to add some solder to it. To cover it. Bingo. Perfect. Okay, everything looks pretty set there. It's not my most beautiful solder job by any stretch of the imagination, but it works. And it's gonna get us to where we need to go. I feel good about it, so we'll go ahead and undo our helping hands. Okay, so as you can see, let me just put this in front of the camera and let it focus in. We've got all of our pads soldered. I just wanted to go through with our multimeter here, and I'll put this in camera view so you can see, but you should have the hang of this by now. Make sure that everything is quiet as we walk up and down these pads. Let me just make sure we have a test contact. Okay, we do. And touch that. I think the power and the ground could be touching. They are not. Okay. I think everything else is good to go. Yep. Okay, we are good. I'm gonna take my toothbrush with just a little bit of 99% isopropyl alcohol, and I'm just gonna gently, because this is a small component, scrub the contacts there, and just get all of our schmutz out of the pad area. Looks pretty clean to me. The next thing we want to do is we actually want to incorporate our antenna. So you're going to get two antenna from ORQA. You're going to get a smaller antenna and a larger antenna, or a longer antenna. The antennas themselves are the exact same size, but the tail with which you're working is obviously differently sized. I'm going to go ahead and set the smaller one aside because I don't foresee that being helpful with this build, considering it's a 5-inch build, larger frame, where instead we're going to use our larger antenna, which we're just going to go ahead and line up over our gold circle in the middle there. And once you feel it line up, it won't drop into place, but you'll feel it sort of slide into place. You're just gonna give it a little bit of pressure. You don't wanna put a lot on, and you'll feel it snap into place. It'll just click into place, I guess is a better word. So now we've got our receiver, our antenna, and our wires that'll go into our flight controller. Now, what I like to do to clean things up in the build is I do like to actually twist these wires just by rotating the receiver and the plug in opposite directions. And you'll actually get a better result once we have everything plugged into the flight controller, but you get the idea. You want to do that, and the reason you want to do that is it makes wire management a lot easier inside your build, but also just sort of gives it a cleaner look as well. So I'll go ahead and leave that for now. The last thing we want to do, and I wish so badly that I had transparent heat shrink, but for whatever reason, my brain told me that black will be just fine. And it is. This will be okay. But ideally, you want to be able to see your receiver because there's a status indicator, a light indicator on it that tells you what status it's at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this to a length that it will wrap around the electronic components for the most part, but I'm going to try to leave some space to cut out a spot for the light so that I can see the status indicator light when we're configuring the receiver. So I'm going to take up the length of the wire, and I'm just going to slide this heat shrink over top of everything there. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to take a little pair of my 3D printer cutters, the filament cutters. I'm just going to cut out a nice little square where the light is going to be, the status indicator light, so that I can still see what I'm looking at or what I'm working with when it comes to configuring this receiver. Just something like that, you can see it. Okay, now everything else is covered, which is great. I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that everything slides there. I have a heat gun here that I'm just gonna apply heat to our heat shrink, and you'll see it as you apply heat sort of form around your receiver. You can do this a number of different ways. In the past, I've used matches or not matches, but lighters to apply heat. If you go that route, totally okay. Just be careful not to burn your components. But you can see now we've got a nice even heat shrink. Really happy with how actually that turned out with the status indicator light. That'll allow us to see everything. And we just have to remember that our button to cycle through the different indicators is on the other side. And you don't really need to have that uncovered. You can press that through the heat shrink. So everything looks good to go with our receiver. Now it's just a matter of incorporating our flight controller and then plugging this thing into that once we're ready to go. All right, I'm sure this looks familiar. This is our drone with our ESC and our motors. So we've got, this really looking good at this point. From here, we just need to incorporate our flight controller before we can add other components to the drone. To avoid making the mistake that I made last time, I'm going to refer you to the wiring diagram. That's first and foremost. But the other thing I want to show you is how these plugs plug in. So I'm looking at the plug, the JST connector, not the one with the little clip that goes into the flight controller, but the one with no little clip on it that plugs into the ESC. The way this plugs in is the flat part, not the part with all the little dots and the grooves and things like that. The flat part is going to be facing up when you plug your ESC in. That's the only way it can plug in. You can't plug it in the other way because you'll bend the pins on the inside. So when we're looking at this side of our ESC, the flat side goes up. Okay, so when we're looking at the flat side of this plug, this is how you want your wires oriented. Let me make sure that everything is lined up so that you guys get a good look at what you need to do when it comes to sending the wires from this connector into the connector that you'll add on, because ORQA includes this without this connector on the other end in the flight controller package. So when we're looking at the flat end, let me make sure this focus is in. I'm using the Osmo Pocket 3, the DJI Pocket 3, Osmo Pocket 3, whatever, you know what I'm using. Let me just make sure this focus is in so you can see. All right, this is going to be at the bell, zoom in. You want, when you're looking at the top, closest to me, Farthest away is the opposite side. You want it to go red, black, yellow, green, and then your 4 whites, which are your motor wires. So power, ground, current, or telemetry, and then the other one is the green, and then your 4 motor wires. That's the order that you want those in going into that plug. Otherwise, you run the risk of having happen what happened to me the other day, where everything goes up in flames. So as long as you're set up that way, you're good to go. And pro tip, when you look at the bottom of the flight control, or I'm sorry, not the flight controller, the ESC, you can't really see it well here because it's attached to the drone. When you look at the bottom of this, it will actually have the pads in the order that they need to go in this JST connector. So you'll be able to line everything up and make sure you're plugging everything in just by looking at the opposite side of this ESC. We are ready to insert our flight controller onto our stack. Make sure our ESC plug is on the same side as the ESC is. We'll go ahead and curl our wire up or twist it up just like this to give us optimal room in the build. And then we're going to insert the plug like so into our ESC port. Everything looks good from my end. It's plugged in. Everything looks good, feels good. Okay, so we've got everything plugged in there. I'm gonna go ahead and also plug in our receiver. So our receiver again goes into that SIK port, and we'll just plug it in like so. And make sure I'm twisting this the right way. I am. We'll just twist this up. We don't need to do all of this right now. We can do this actually, it's smarter to do it once we get more of the build integrated. But just for the sake of showing you, that's how we'll twist that up. Now is the moment of truth. I do have the ViFly smoke stopper here. I also have a new smoke stopper. Because I've already plugged this in with this smoke stopper before I recorded this video, just to double check myself, I'm not gonna get away from what we've already done, because when you introduce new elements, that's when things go wrong. So for that reason, I am gonna stick with the same smoke stopper that let us down the last time. So I'm gonna go ahead and plug the smoke stopper in first. We're good there. And then I'm gonna plug our battery in. Now, if everything went according to plan, like I said, then we should get power to this and there should be no sparks. Forgive me for leaning backwards a little bit because I have a little bit of PTSD from this. Let's go ahead, even though I've already tested this, and make sure that everything worked correctly. Here we go. Voila, that's what we want. We want those beeps, we want those lights, we want the reaction we got. We have a light in our receiver, we have a light on our flight controller. Everything booted up the way it was supposed to boot up at this point. So, mission accomplished. We've incorporated our flight controller, our receiver into our build. Now, it's just a matter of getting our camera system set up on our drone so that we can fly it with our goggles.
And it's just as easy as that. I know this video was a little bit on the long side for what we actually got accomplished on the drone, but really we are just a few steps away from having this completed. I'm really excited at where we're at this point, especially after the catastrophic faux pas on my part, being able to get that flight controller plugged in and ready to go. Man, I couldn't ask for being in a better place at this point in the face of everything that we've experienced with this build. This is awesome to have this component integrated. There will be a new video inserted into the series timeline. I will be replacing the SpeedX motors. The silver lining to the setback that we experienced with the ORQA flight controllers burning out because of an error on my part is not only that we formed a relationship with the folks over at ORQA and we can now call them friends, and the fact that they sent us all these awesome components here that I'll be incorporating in a future build, but we also bought time for an unexpected outreach from somebody at Mad Components. So in the time that it took ORQA to get the parts to me to replace the parts that I had burnt out, Mad Components reached out and they said, hey, we just saw your build series video. We saw that you're using Chinese motors. We have a manufacturing facility in Las Vegas, Nevada that manufactures motors that are built for 5-inch FPV drones. And I thought, Well, dang, what a perfect coincidence. So they're on their way. I don't know when they're going to get here. So I'm just going to continue forward with the Gep RC motors. I don't think this is a huge deal at this point because a motor is a motor is a motor, and they're going to fit. They're almost the exact same size. So whether you stick with the Gep RCs or not, or you go out and you order these mad, I think they're called Conquer motors, does not matter. It doesn't matter. You're still going to get similar performance out of your build. And frankly, the reason that I'm okay with replacing this component and not others is because it's not a huge deal, and also it helps us to further future-proof a part that was otherwise Chinese. Because even though right now NDAA compliance states that you can utilize Chinese frames and motors and components that don't transmit information that could be considered critical or sensitive, even though we can get away with these, it is nice to have motors that are manufactured in the United States. So in the event, the very likely event, that the NDAA verbiage changes again and they say, hey, you can't even use Chinese motors now, we'll already have US manufactured motors on our drone. But yeah, guys, you're really close. You're knocking on the doorstep. Next week's video, we're going to be integrating the camera and the VTX. So those are going to be the two components that we include on our build next week. Again, not going to be a super long video when it comes to time on the workbench. And frankly, we don't really need a lot of background information on the camera and the VTX. There'll be a little bit I share with you that'll give you some context for how they work and how you can configure them. But largely, I'm going to save a lot of that for once we have the drone built and we know that everything is being powered on and working. So once we get to that part, we're good to go. But yeah, again, next week's video should be pretty short on the workbench as well. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon down below. It helps me out a lot. It helps get this video out into the algorithm to more viewers like yourself. If you really like this video and you love drone content shot by drones, about drones, and for drone pilots, my friend, this is the channel for you. Make sure you get subscribed if you haven't already. I'm really excited about this series, guys, so please give me your feedback. Good, bad, ugly, anything in between. Just try to spare my feelings if you can. Really appreciated, but all feedback is welcome. So let me know down in the comments below what you think of this series. Until next time, I'm Chris the Drone Geek. I'm out of here. See ya.
Yo, what you say? Steady screaming, yo, no rocket polo, we the fight.